Welcome back to the Quantum Slumber. If this is your first time here, this is our quiet little corner of the universe. A place where we take the strangest ideas from physics and philosophy, slow them down, and gently turn them over in the dark until they're soft enough to fall asleep to. Tonight, I want to start with a question that sounds simple, but becomes more unsettling the longer you sit with it. From your own point of view, do you ever actually get to be dead? Not in the abstract sense of someday I will die. Not as a thought about the future, but as an experience. You have experienced being 5 years old, or 15, or 30. You have experienced being sick, being exhausted, being joyful, being heartbroken. But you have never, in any direct way, experienced being gone. Whenever awareness is there, you are there. Whenever you're not aware, there is no one around to notice. Now, imagine something stranger. Imagine that every single time in your life when you almost died, the near miss in traffic, the test result that could have gone the other way, the moment you narrowly avoided a fall, reality quietly branched. In one version, you didn't make it. In another, you walked away. And your consciousness simply kept following the path where you survived, over and over again. What if that never stops? What if, as the laws of quantum physics play out behind the scenes, there is always some tiny, improbable branch in which your heart keeps beating, your brain keeps flickering, and your awareness never quite manages to wink out? What if, from the inside, it feels like you just keep waking up, no matter how unlikely survival should be? That unsettling possibility has a name: quantum immortality. And tonight, we're going to wander slowly into that idea together, not to scare you, but to look at it calmly, carefully, the way you might study a strange pattern of light on the ceiling while you're drifting off to sleep. So, as we settle into this, you might notice where you are right now. Maybe you're lying in bed, room lights low, phone or laptop glowing softly in the dark. Maybe you're on a couch, letting the day finally loosen its grip. Wherever you are in the world, this moment is just you, your thoughts, and a universe that might be far stranger than it first appears. If you'd like to, you can let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing those little points of light from all over the planet. And if you find comfort in these late-night journeys through deep questions and quiet science, you can gently tap like or subscribe so you can come back here whenever you need another slow walk through the cosmos. For now, though, just breathe, get comfortable, and let's follow this strange idea a little further. Think for a moment about how many times your life has already leaned toward an edge you didn't quite go over. Maybe it was a car that missed you by half a second at an intersection. You remember the screech of the brakes, the blur of headlights, that strange slow motion awareness as your body tensed and waited for impact. And then nothing happened. Maybe it was a health scare, a test result that could have meant something terrible, but didn't. Or a night you walked home alone and later heard that something bad had happened on that same street, just not to you. Most people carry one or two of those stories. Some people carry a lot of them. And almost always, we wrap them in the same simple word: luck. We usually call it luck, we say. I was so lucky. But if you look closely at it, that word doesn't explain very much. It just quietly labels a feeling, the sense that something could have gone differently, and somehow it didn't. If you talk to people who have come very close to dying, you'll hear a certain tone in their voice when they say, "I shouldn't even be here." They're not doing math. They're feeling the gap between what was likely and what actually happened. The odds seemed to point in one direction, yet their story went another way. And now they're left with this uneasy gratitude, thankful to be alive, and slightly haunted by the fact that they almost weren't. From the outside, we can list all the reasons. The driver hit the brakes just in time. The surgeon's hands were steady. The medication worked. The tree missed the house when it fell. We can line up the chain of causes and say, "See, that's why you survived." But from the inside, from the point of view of the person whose awareness is riding along that timeline, it feels different. One moment they were bracing for the end. The next moment, they were still there. and that still there is the only thing you've ever actually known. This is where your role as an observer becomes important. You do not experience the world from the outside as a list of events that either happen or don't. You experience it as a narrow line of moments that you move through one after another from the center of your own awareness. You never step out of that. You never watch yourself from above, the way someone might look down at a timeline drawn on paper. You are always inside the experience, seeing through your own eyes. From inside that stream, there is a simple truth. You never directly experience your own absence. The lights may go out someday. They will, eventually, for all of us. But whatever that is, it is not another experience that you get to have. You can only ever be present for the moments in which you're still here. Whenever you are aware, you are alive. Whenever you are not aware, there is no one at home to register what that's like. So if you think about your life as a chain of events, it's very easy to slip into a particular illusion. You look back and see all the times you survived, and somehow it feels as if survival was the natural outcome all along. Because it's the only outcome that left you around to notice it. All the other possibilities, the branches where you didn't make it, vanish from your point of view. Your memory, by definition, can only contain the paths in which you continued. Up to this point, we can say this in the language of everyday life. We talk about near misses, about close calls, about second chances. But in the background, there's another story being whispered by physics. A story about chance that is much stranger than the way we use that word in casual conversation. In the world of everyday objects, chance is often just a way of admitting we don't know everything. When you flip a coin, in principle, if you somehow knew the exact force of your thumb, the air currents, the angle, and the spin, you could calculate where it would land. You call it random because you're missing information. The coin itself isn't undecided. You just don't know enough to predict the decision. But when you zoom in far enough, down to electrons, photons, tiny particles flickering in and out of detection, something changes. Even if you know everything there is to know about the setup, the initial conditions, the equations, the best you can do is talk about probabilities. At that level, nature doesn't hand you one guaranteed outcome. It hands you a menu of options, each with a certain weight, and it only shows you which one you got when you actually look. When physicists talk about this, they don't mean random in the loose, everyday sense. They mean that, as far as all our experiments can tell, the universe itself is built to allow multiple possible futures at once, until an interaction or a measurement forces one of them to become the version you experience. Before that moment, the situation isn't just unknown, it's genuinely undecided in a very deep way. Now put these two ideas side by side. On one side, you have a cosmos, where events at the smallest scales are not fixed in stone, but spread out across different possibilities. On the other side, you have your own life as a single, unbroken line of awareness that only ever passes through the moments in which you are still alive to witness them. You never get to stand outside that line. You never get to peek into the branches where you didn't continue. That combination leads to a disturbing kind of question. If the universe is always rolling quantum dice in the background, and if your experience can only ever track the outcomes in which your consciousness persists, is it really surprising that, looking back, your story is stitched together entirely out of survivals? Is it an accident that you find yourself in a world where you just barely made it again and again? Or is that simply the only kind of world you could ever remember? We're not answering those questions yet. For now, we're just letting them sit there, the way you might let a strange thought rest on the edge of your mind as you stare at the ceiling in a dark room. Because somewhere in that overlap, between quantum chance and your private line of awareness, between the dice the universe is throwing and the simple fact that you are here to see the result, that's where this unsettling idea lives. To understand why that overlap between chance and awareness is so strange, we have to shrink our gaze, not to the scale of cars or test results or hospital rooms, but far below all of that, down to the level where the universe hasn't yet decided which way things will go. In everyday life, we're used to things being one way or another. A light is on or off. A door is open or closed. You're in the room or you're not. Even if you're unsure for a moment, you assume there's a definite fact out there waiting to be checked. The light is either on or off right now, whether you've looked at the switch or not. At the quantum scale, that intuition stops working. Imagine a tiny particle with a simple property, like spin, that can show up in one of two ways when you measure it. We might label them up or down. In our everyday thinking, that's like a coin, heads or tails. It feels natural to assume that before you look, the particle already has one of those definite values, and your measurement just reveals which one you've got. But when we actually perform experiments with these particles, that picture doesn't fit. The math that successfully predicts what we see doesn't say, the particle is secretly up or secretly down. It says something more unsettling. Before you measure, the particle exists in a combination of both possibilities at once. Not up or down, but a blended state we call a superposition. This is one of those words that sounds fancy, but the idea is simple and weird. The world, at that level, doesn't commit to just one outcome until there is an interaction that counts as a measurement. Before that, the particle behaves as if all the options are somehow real together, overlapping in a way that doesn't resemble anything in our ordinary experience. You might have heard of Schrödinger's cat, the famous thought experiment where a cat in a sealed box is tied in a roundabout way to a quantum event. If the event goes one way, the cat lives. If it goes the other way, the cat dies. As long as the box stays closed, the story says, the quantum system is in a superposition of both possibilities. Taken literally, that would mean the cat is somehow both alive and dead, at the same time, in the same box. Schrödinger didn't propose this because he thought cats really do linger in that half-alive limbo. He proposed it to show how bizarre the quantum rules are when you drag them from the microscopic world up into ours. There's a clash between the way the equations describe the system as a smooth, evolving cloud of possibilities, and the way we experience the world as a series of clear, definite outcomes. That clash has a name, the measurement problem. On paper, the quantum state of a system evolves according to a neat, linear equation. It spreads, it interferes with itself, it branches into different potential outcomes. But the moment you perform a measurement, it seems as though something different happens. The spread out cloud of possibilities collapses into one specific result. The particle is now definitely spin up. The detector is definitely triggered. The cat is definitely on one side of the line or the other. Our best equations don't actually tell us how that collapse happens, or even if it really does. They just tell us how to calculate the probabilities for each possible outcome, and then they instruct us to update the state once we've seen the result, as if the universe has suddenly made up its mind. So, we're left with a puzzle. Before you looked, was there already a single, definite reality hiding behind the scenes, and quantum mechanics is just a clever way of describing our ignorance? Or is the world itself truly suspended between different futures, until something about the act of measurement forces one of them to crystallize into the version you experience? For a while, some people flirted with a dramatic answer. Maybe consciousness has something to do with it. Maybe the reason the wave of possibilities collapses into one outcome is that a conscious observer comes along and registers what happened. The universe decides when a mind is there to witness the decision. Most physicists today don't think that's the right explanation. There are other ways to frame what a measurement is, and other interpretations of the theory that don't need a mind to do any special work. But the suggestion stuck around in our culture because it speaks directly to the part of you that never leaves the center of its own experience. It raises the uncomfortable suspicion that the line between out there and in here isn't as clean as we'd like. Even without making consciousness magical, you can feel the tension. On one hand, you have this formal picture of a world made of wave functions, objects and states that can be superpositions of many possibilities at once. On the other hand, your lived reality never appears that way. You don't feel like a cloud of maybes. You feel like a single definite person moving through a single definite sequence of moments. The measurement problem is, in part, the mismatch between those two descriptions. If the quantum state really is a spread of genuine possibilities, what exactly turns them into the one outcome that becomes your actual experience? If, instead, it's just a clever bookkeeping tool, why does it work so uncannily well in predicting how matter behaves? These questions sit right at the boundary where physics and philosophy blur into one another. You don't need to follow every technical detail to feel the strangeness. It's enough to notice that, at the smallest scales we can probe, the universe does not behave like a solid machine grinding along a single, predetermined track. It behaves more like a field of options, weighted and waiting, until something happens that forces one of them to be the story you remember. And once you see it that way, the idea that your own life might be stitched together from paths where you continue, while countless other possibilities quietly fade from your awareness, doesn't feel quite so distant from the rules written into the fabric of reality. At the foundations, the world isn't built out of fixed, rigid facts. It's built out of chances, tendencies, and branching possibilities that only become definite when they are, in some sense, encountered. In the last stretch, we were looking at this strange picture that quantum mechanics gives us, a world where, before we look, something as simple as a particle's spin isn't pinned down to one value. It's spread out over several possibilities at once, described by a single smooth wave of potential outcomes. Then, when a measurement happens, that spread seems to snap into one definite result. For a long time, people simply accepted that snap as part of the rules. The wave function, this mathematical object that holds all the possibilities, evolves gently and predictably until a measurement occurs. At that moment, according to the traditional story, it suddenly collapses, and only one outcome survives. It works astonishingly well as a recipe for predicting experiments, but it leaves a nagging question hanging in the dark. What exactly counts as a measurement? And why should the universe behave in two completely different ways? In the 1950s, a young physicist named Hugh Everett III tried something bold. Instead of adding a special rule for measurements, he asked, what if there is no collapse at all? What if the wave function always evolves smoothly and never jumps? What if, rather than destroying the unrealized possibilities, the universe somehow keeps them all? Everett's answer became what we now call the many worlds interpretation. In his view, when a quantum system is in a superposition, spin up and spin down, both present in the mathematics, that description is not just a statement about our ignorance. It is a statement about the world. Both possibilities are real, coexisting in a single, larger state. And when an interaction happens that we would usually call a measurement, the universe doesn't choose one and discard the rest. Instead, it separates into branches, with each possible outcome playing out in its own, newly distinct version of reality. You can imagine it like a tree growing new limbs. The trunk is the shared past, the history before the measurement. At the branching point, one limb carries the spin-up outcome, another carries spin down. The laws of physics continue along each limb in the usual way. Nothing magical happens to the equations. They simply describe a bigger, more complex structure than we first assumed. Of course, we don't feel as though we're living in a giant tree of diverging realities. From the perspective of your everyday life, there is only one sequence of events. The detector either clicks or it doesn't. The cat in the box is either alive when you open it, or it sadly isn't. Everett's idea says that both futures are realized, but they are realized in different branches, each containing its own version of you, its own record of what happened. Once you start thinking in those terms, you can expand the picture beyond laboratory experiments. Every process that depends on quantum events, and at some level, that is almost everything, becomes a place where branches spread. The path of a single photon, the precise moment a neuron fires, the tiny fluctuations in matter in the early universe. All of it is woven into this vast, ever-branching structure. In one branch, a driver taps the brakes a fraction of a second earlier. In another, they don't. In one branch, you get on a particular flight. In another, you miss it and stay home. The possibilities fan out like a river, splitting into countless channels, each one carrying a slightly different story downstream. In some, your life looks very much like the one you know. In others, it took a subtle detour years ago, and everything from your job to your friendships feels unfamiliar. From some imaginary vantage point outside the whole structure, you could, in principle, see all of these versions at once. A tapestry of histories, each internally consistent, each containing its own you who remembers a slightly different past. But there is no ordinary way to occupy that godlike perch. You never step out of your branch to survey the entire tree. You only ever inhabit one line. From inside your branch, your story feels unique and continuous. You remember a single childhood, a single set of choices, a single string of lucky breaks and painful turns. You don't experience the moments in which a different version of you took that other job, or met that other person, or didn't walk away from that near miss. Those paths are invisible to you, not because they're forbidden, but because your awareness rides along just one of the many limbs. This is where Everett's view begins to whisper to the questions we've been circling. If reality really does branch whenever quantum possibilities are in play, then there is, in this picture, a near-endless variety of yous spread across the multiverse. Some almost identical to you, some radically different, all of them thinking of themselves as the original. And every time an event has multiple possible outcomes, the tree quietly grows another layer of twigs. Most of the time, these different branches don't feel dramatic. In one, you spill your coffee, in another, you don't. In one, you catch a cold this winter, in another, your immune system wins a tiny unnoticed battle. Life rolls on either way. But sometimes, the stakes of a branching event are much higher. Sometimes, the difference between one outcome and another is the difference between your story continues and your story ends. In many worlds, the math doesn't treat those outcomes any differently from a coin toss. There are branches in which your heart keeps beating after a close call, and branches in which it doesn't. There are branches in which the surgery succeeds against the odds, and ones in which the odds win. From the external view, the view that takes the whole wave function seriously, both kinds of branches are there, growing side by side, each with its own consistent reality. But remember, you never occupy that outside perspective. You only ever experience the branches in which you remain capable of having experiences at all. By definition, you do not find yourself in the realities where your awareness has already gone dark. Your memories, your sense of self, your entire inner world can only be carried forward along those limbs where you survived whatever just happened. That is the subtle, eerie suggestion that begins to emerge when you combine Everett's branching universe with the fact that your consciousness is always, by necessity, located on the side of survival. And when people follow that suggestion to its extreme, when they ask what it would mean to always find yourself in one of the branches where you go on, they arrive at the unsettling notion that sits at the heart of this episode. Because in a universe that truly splits for every quantum event, with countless versions of you walking down countless paths, there will always be some branches where you make it through the worst that can happen. And from the only vantage point you ever really have, the one inside your own awareness, it can start to look as though your story might never quite manage to stop. That quiet, chilling possibility is what people call quantum immortality. To see how far this idea can be pushed, people sometimes imagine a very extreme scenario. It's not a real experiment, and it absolutely should never be tried. But as a thought experiment, it forces the logic of many worlds and consciousness into a very sharp point. It's often called quantum suicide. Picture a kind of machine built around a quantum event. At its heart is a device that measures something genuinely random in the quantum sense. Maybe the spin of a particle, or whether a single radioactive atom decays in a given window of time. The rules of quantum mechanics say that, before measurement, the system is in a superposition of possible results. When you measure, there is, say, a 50% chance of outcome A and a 50% chance of outcome B. Now imagine connecting those outcomes to something much more personal. In the classic version of the thought experiment, outcome A is tied to a lethal mechanism, and outcome B is tied to nothing at all. The setup is morbid on purpose. If the device registers A, the mechanism fires and the experimenter dies. If it registers B, nothing happens and the experimenter survives unharmed. Each run is like flipping a coin where one side means instant death, and the other side means you walk away. From the perspective of ordinary physics, the story is simple. Each time the machine runs, there's a 1 in 2 chance that it triggers and a 1 in 2 chance that it doesn't. If someone were reckless enough to actually build such a thing and repeat the procedure, an external observer watching from the outside would expect the experimenter's luck to run out very quickly. After just a few attempts, the probability of surviving every single round drops to a tiny number. In other words, almost all of the time, this experiment ends abruptly. The outside observer sees a short sequence: click, survive, click, survive, click, and then nothing. The machine fires, the person dies, and the story is over. But the many worlds picture tells a different, more layered story. From that point of view, each run of the machine doesn't simply pick one outcome and erase the other. Instead, the universe branches. In one branch, the quantum device records A, the lethal mechanism activates, and the experimenter's consciousness ceases. In the other branch, it records B, the mechanism stays quiet, and the experimenter continues to exist. After the first run, then, there are two versions of reality. One in which the experimenter is dead, and one in which they are still alive. After the second run, each of those branches splits again. Some of the results in branches contain an alive experimenter, others do not. With every press of the metaphorical trigger, more branches are created, some carrying the story forward, some ending it. Now here is where the unsettling twist comes in. Ask yourself, from the point of view of the person inside the experiment, which branches can they ever experience? Not the ones in which they died, because there is no awareness there to register anything. Their conscious story can only continue along the branches where the mechanism did not fire, where the quantum device happened to land on the safe outcome. So, while an outside observer sees the experimenter's odds of survival shrink with each run, the experimenter, in this idealized picture, has a very different experience. As far as their awareness is concerned, every time they press the button, they hear the click, and then find themselves still there. The sequence, I'm alive, I press the trigger, I'm still alive, repeats itself again and again, because their conscious perspective can never follow the branches where it ends. In the language of ordinary probability, this sounds absurd. If you flip a coin that kills you on heads and leaves you alone on tails, you shouldn't expect to survive hundreds of flips. The chance of making it through that many rounds is effectively zero. But in a branching universe, effectively zero does not mean non-existent. There will be enormously many branches where you die early, and a tiny fraction where you don't. The vast majority of versions of you vanish quickly. A few improbably make it to flip number 10, or 100, or 1,000. The vision behind quantum suicide is that your subjective experience would always be attached to those rare branches where you continue. From that inner viewpoint, it never feels like your luck runs out, no matter how many times you should have died. The experimenter's world becomes a long, unlikely chain of survivals, stitched together from outcomes that grow more and more improbable. Follow that line of reasoning to its limit, and you arrive at the idea of quantum immortality. If the universe truly branches for each quantum event, if every possible outcome is realized somewhere, and if your conscious awareness can only ever find itself in branches where it still exists, then, At least in this thought experiment, there is no final moment in which you experience your own death. From inside your own perspective, the story simply keeps extending. Each time your life is on the line, there is always at least one branch where you make it through, and that is the only branch you can ever occupy. From the outside, most versions of you still die at perfectly ordinary times. There is no magic in the statistics. The measure of branches where you survive for an absurdly long time may be incredibly small, but from the first-person point of view, that doesn't matter. You never wake up as one of the versions that didn't make it. You only ever wake up as the one that did. It's a deeply strange conclusion that if you mix many worlds with a certain way of thinking about consciousness, you can end up with a kind of immortality that doesn't require eternal souls, miraculous technology, or unbreakable bodies. It requires only that there is always some branch in which your brain is still functioning well enough to support awareness, and that your sense of self is somehow tied to those branches and not the others. In that sense, the promise of quantum immortality is not bright or comforting. It's not the fantasy of living forever in perfect health, surrounded by everyone you love. It's more like a grim guarantee that, in some sliver of the multiverse, you keep going no matter what happens. Not because the universe is kind, but because your doubts and fears can only ever arise in worlds where you are still able to have them. Of course, all of this lives firmly in the realm of speculation. Even the physicists who first sketched these ideas treat the quantum suicide scenario as a philosophical probe, not a proposal. It's designed to expose how unsettling the logic of branching worlds can become when you attach a conscious observer to the process and follow that logic wherever it leads. Still, when you combine the branching universe with the simple fact that you only ever occupy branches where you haven't yet faded away, you get a picture that is hard to shake, a lone line of awareness threading its way through a forest of possible realities, always sidestepping the branches where it would have ended. In the next phase of our journey tonight, we'll look at what that could mean if you extend it beyond a thought experiment. What it might feel like if your life really did stretch out along those unlikely paths, surviving into versions of the world that grow more twisted, more painful, and more isolating as ordinary possibilities fall away. Up to now, the idea has had a kind of cold fascination to it, a strange loophole in the rules. If reality keeps splitting, and your awareness can only ever find itself on the side where it continues, then maybe, from the inside, your story never quite stops. On paper, that sounds almost like a superpower. The words immortal and can't die are very good at lighting up some deep, stubborn wish inside us. But if you follow the logic carefully, the picture that emerges is not the fantasy of living forever in a gentle, upgraded body. It's something much harsher. Quantum immortality, taken seriously, doesn't promise happiness. It doesn't promise health or youth or anything about the quality of your experience. It doesn't say, you'll keep going in the best possible worlds. All it says, if it says anything at all, is that there will always be branches where your awareness doesn't shut down, and that your subjective story, by definition, can only ever ride along those. That sounds very different when you think about what it means across an entire lifetime. Imagine, for a moment, one of those close calls we talked about earlier, but this time the odds really are stacked against you. It's a terrible car accident on the highway, a fall from a height, some sudden medical catastrophe. In most branches of the multiverse, this is the end of your story. Your body is damaged beyond repair. The version of you in those worlds doesn't wake up again. But most branches isn't the same as all branches. There will be some sliver of the branching tree where the impact is just a little different, the angle just a little kinder, the emergency response just a little closer. In those branches, you survive, but not cleanly. Your body is broken. Your nervous system is battered. The brain that gives rise to your awareness is injured, but not destroyed. From the outside, people in that world might say, it would have been better if they hadn't made it. They might mean that in a practical way. Your quality of life is so low, your suffering so constant, that death would have been a release. They see a person whose days are now measured out in painkillers, hospital beds, and the fluorescent hum of machines. From the inside, though, there is only one simple fact: you are still here. You wake up into a world of sharp, unignorable sensations. Maybe your spine is damaged. Maybe your limbs don't respond. Perhaps your thoughts move more slowly than they used to, but they still move, and there is enough structure left in your mind to understand what's happened. You remember who you were before. You can compare it to who you are now, and you realize that the path you're on is one of the rare, unlucky branches where life continues at a cost you never would have chosen. Quantum immortality does not pull you out of that. It doesn't step in and say, "No, we'll put you in a better branch instead." It simply says, if a branch like that exists, and if your story continues, then from your own point of view, this is one of the branches you could wake up in. Now stretch that forward in time. Even in our current medical reality, we can sometimes keep a person alive for a long while after their body has passed the point of real recovery. Machines can breathe for you, feed you, filter your blood. Medications can keep a fragile balance from tipping over. Life support can hold the line in situations that, in another era, would have been quickly fatal. In most worlds, those lines eventually fail. A small shift in blood chemistry, a stray infection, a tiny clot, an unnoticed error in a busy ward. Any one of them can carry you gently over the edge. But, once again, most is not all. In a branching universe, there are always a few threads where each crisis passes without quite finishing the story. The infection clears, the clot misses, the machine gets repaired just in time. The code blues are always somehow reversed. If your awareness follows those threads, what does that feel like? It might feel like waking up again and again in a hospital room that changes only in subtle ways. Different nurses, different seasons out the window, different beeps and lights and IV bags, but the same underlying situation. Your body grows weaker, your world shrinks to a bed, a ceiling, and the slow drip of days that blur into one another. People come to visit less often, their lives move on. Yours narrows to the experience of being kept going by systems you barely understand. From the point of view of an outside statistician, these are extraordinarily unlikely stories. It's the tail end of a distribution where improbable survival after improbable survival stacks up until the numbers become almost vanishingly small. But the hypothesis of quantum immortality whispers that it doesn't matter how small those numbers are, as long as they're not exactly zero. There will always be a branch where the unlikely happens, and if your consciousness always lands there, then improbability becomes your home. And there's another layer, the people around you. Think about your friends, your family, the people whose lives are entangled with yours. In the vast majority of branches, there's a day when they say goodbye to you. There's a funeral or a quiet memorial, or maybe just a private moment when they finally accept that you're not coming back. They grieve, time passes, new routines grow up around the absence you left. The world writes your name into the past, tense. But in the rare branches where you cling on, their lives don't pause. Maybe they sit by your bedside for a while, hoping for some sign that you're still really there. Maybe they rearrange their schedules to care for you. Eventually, though, many of them are pulled away by the gravity of their own responsibilities. Children grow up, jobs change, people move, some relationships fracture under the strain, others mellow into a quiet, guilty distance. In a sense, they are already living in one of the worlds where you didn't make it in the way that mattered. The version of you they knew is gone. What remains is a fragile, altered presence in a bed, or in a care facility, or in a small, dim apartment filled with medical equipment. Their stories go on, branching and maturing, and finding new centers of meaning. And you, on these strange, stubborn branches, are left behind. This is one of the darkest implications people draw from the idea of quantum immortality. Not just survival into pain, but survival into increasing isolation. The more unlikely your continued existence becomes, the more your circumstances must twist to accommodate it. The circle of people who still orbit you shrinks. The coincidences required to keep you alive pile up. The world around you starts to feel less like the familiar, shared reality you grew up in, and more like a narrow corridor of strange, specific outcomes, designed only to maintain a flicker of awareness. Some have described this as becoming a kind of probability ghost, a consciousness clinging to the thinnest, strangest slivers of the multiverse, where everything that needed to go right for you to still be here somehow did, even when it shouldn't have. The metaphor is imperfect, but the mood it evokes is clear. You as a faint, flickering presence wandering through scenarios that feel increasingly out of step with what most people would recognize as normal life. You can see how the romantic glow of "I never die" fades very quickly when you trace the consequences this way. Immortality in this story is not a reward. It's more like an inexhaustible capacity to find yourself in circumstances where death would have been the kinder outcome. But it never quite arrives. And remember, this isn't limited to dramatic accidents or long hospital stays. Your body ages. Systems break down. Cells misbehave. In everyday biology, there comes a point where everything fails together. In a many worlds framework, there will also be eccentric branches where failures are delayed, patched over, or bypassed in unlikely ways. Maybe a tumor grows more slowly here, a clot dissolves there, a fragile artery holds on one more day, and then another and another. Each reprieve buys you more time, but not necessarily more life in the sense that we usually mean it. When you imagine stacking decades of these unlikely reprieves on top of each other, the picture becomes almost unbearable. A mind stretched thin over failing tissue, a self pieced together out of fragments of memory and habit, a series of rooms increasingly unfamiliar where you keep waking up because some obscure combination of events has once again allowed you to. If your subjective perspective really does stick to survival at all costs, then the most optimistic branches, the ones where you died peacefully, surrounded by people you loved at a time that felt right, are precisely the ones you never get to inhabit for long. You only get to look back at moments like that from the outside, wondering why they never quite materialized for you. In that light, the promise of quantum immortality reveals itself as a kind of nightmare, not eternal youth, but the possibility of enduring into versions of reality that grow more and more misaligned with what you would have chosen. Not endless adventures, but endless aftermaths. A future built not out of meaningful chapters, but out of leftovers. The thin, improbable branches where your awareness still has just enough support to persist. It is this shadowed version of the idea, survival pushed into places it was never meant to go, that we're really dealing with when we talk about the dark side of quantum immortality. And once you see that, it becomes natural to ask deeper questions. If the worlds where you linger are so strange, and the cost of staying is so high, what happens to your sense of self inside them? How long can you remain you as the years stretch further and further into these unlikely corridors? That's where we'll turn next, away from the physical horror of broken bodies and lonely rooms, and toward the quieter, more unsettling territory of identity, memory, and what it means for a mind to keep going when almost everything that once defined it has been left behind. So far, we've been talking about bodies and hospitals and the way a life could be stretched into stranger and stranger corners of the multiverse. But there's another question hiding under all of that, and it's in some ways even more unsettling. Who exactly is the you that would be living through it? Even in an ordinary non-quantum life, identity is not as solid as we like to pretend. You're not the same person you were at 5 or 15 or 25. Your habits change, your values drift, experiences leave their mark, but you can still feel a kind of thread running through it all. A sense that, despite the changes, there's one continuous me that has been here the whole time, watching the movie from the same seat, Quantum immortality, if you take it seriously, pulls at that thread. Remember what Many Worlds is saying. Every time there's a genuinely quantum event with multiple possible outcomes, the universe branches. In some branches, you get the promotion. In others, you don't. In some, the accident is minor. In others, it's catastrophic. Each branch carries a version of you, with its own slightly different history. Most of those versions are perfectly ordinary people, living perfectly ordinary lives. But when we combine this with the idea that your subjective experience might stick to the branches where you never quite die, something strange happens to that sense of continuity. Every time you should have reached your end and didn't, your story jumps onto a rarer, more unusual branch. The version of you that wakes up after the close call is not literally the same physical person as the one who almost died in another branch. It's a neighbor, a copy with the same memories up to that point, continuing from a different outcome. From the outside, this is just how the math works. Different branches, different states. But from the inside, what does that do to the meaning of I? Suppose in one of those unlikely survival branches, your brain is injured. Not so badly that consciousness disappears altogether, but enough to change you. Maybe certain memories don't come when called. Maybe your temperament shifts. A calm person becomes irritable. A cautious person becomes reckless. Someone who once loved music now finds it flat and meaningless. We know from neuroscience that small changes to the brain can produce profound changes in personality. A tiny stroke, a tumor pressing in the wrong place, a bit of trauma in a specific region. And the way you think, feel, and decide can be altered in ways that the old you might not even recognize. If quantum immortality keeps you riding the branches where you survive injuries like that, then your immortality isn't a smooth extension of the person you are now. It's a chain of slightly different people, each inheriting the memories of the last, each carrying forward a somewhat edited version of who you once were. At what point does that chain become so stretched that the word you starts to feel like a polite fiction? You can imagine your life as a film reel, a sequence of frames, each one a snapshot of your mind and body at a particular moment. In an ordinary life, those frames are spaced closely together. The changes from one to the next are small enough that your sense of self glides over them without noticing. Decades later, you can still look back and feel a kind of continuity, even if you've changed a lot. But in the darker versions of quantum immortality, those frames begin to spread out. As your survival becomes more and more improbable, as your body and brain endure more damage, there might be longer stretches of time where there simply isn't much clear awareness. Maybe days or weeks pass in a haze of sedation. Maybe your mind spends long periods in something like a coma, with only brief islands of clarity between them. From your perspective, those islands are the only frames that exist. You blink, and it's months later. You blink again, and it's years. Your memories connect these scattered moments with whatever fragments your injured brain can piece together. The in-between stretches are just gone. Consciousness in that scenario becomes a series of disjointed flashes, a ceiling in one hospital, then another in a different city, a nurse's face you half recognize, a window with a tree that's taller than you remember. Each time you surface, you have to reconstruct who you are and how you got there from whatever hints your surroundings and your damaged memory can provide. Now add one more layer of weirdness. If reality really does branch constantly, and if, in some way we don't understand, your awareness always tracks the branches where you're still alive, there's at least a speculative hint that your memories might not line up perfectly with the world around you. The versions of you in neighboring branches are almost identical, but not quite. They've made slightly different choices. They've had slightly different conversations. They've lived through slightly different days. If, in some deeply mysterious way, your conscious perspective could drift across these neighboring branches as part of this never-dying story, you might occasionally find yourself carrying memories that don't match your current reality perfectly. They'd be close enough that you could explain away most of the differences, but not exact. Maybe you remember a friend owning a blue car, But in this branch, it's always been red. Maybe you're certain a conversation went one way, but everyone else insists it went another. Little mismatches, small enough to dismiss, but just frequent enough to leave you with a lingering feeling that something is off. In everyday life, we already have words for these glitches. Déjà vu, false memories, the sense that we've seen this before, or that a scene is slightly wrong somehow. Cognitive science is very good at explaining these experiences in terms of how fallible and reconstructive memory really is. But if you overlay the logic of quantum immortality onto that, you can spin a more haunting story. A self whose memories have been contaminated by neighboring branches, trying to navigate a world that never quite lines up with the past it recalls. You don't have to believe that story literally to feel the mood it evokes. The idea isn't so much that we are slipping between branches all the time, but that an immortal consciousness tied to survival at all costs might eventually feel like that. Like a wandering awareness trying to hold itself together across an increasingly fragmented landscape of bodies, rooms, and histories. And as your body continues to fail, that fragmentation only grows. There might come a point where your memories are so patchy, your personality so altered, that the connection between the person you once were and the person who now exists is very thin. Shared name, some overlapping memories, maybe a few persistent habits. But so many of the traits you would have used to describe yourself are gone. If you think of you as a particular pattern of thoughts, feelings, and memories, you're forced into a difficult question. As that pattern is gradually eroded, is quantum immortality really keeping you alive, or just keeping something alive? A process? A flicker? A series of awareness moments that can trace their ancestry back to you in the way a distant descendant can trace their DNA back to an ancestor. But that doesn't necessarily feel like the same person. At some stage along that road, survival and identity start to pull apart. The unsettling possibility is that a theory like quantum immortality might be very good at preserving the bare fact that someone is still having experiences, while being very bad at preserving the richer, more meaningful sense of self that makes a life feel like yours. The light stays on, in other words, but the room it's illuminating changes shape over and over, until the person standing in it barely resembles the one who first stepped inside. And that leads to a final quiet question that sits right at the heart of this whole idea. If your memories can scatter, your personality can shift, your body can fail and be patched together again and again, and your consciousness only comes in brief flickers between long gaps, what exactly is the thing that would be living forever? In the next part of our journey, we'll zoom back out to the cosmic scale and look at what happens when you place that fragile, flickering self inside a universe that's also drifting toward its own kind of ending. A universe where even reality itself seems to bend around the improbability of your continued existence. When you place this strange, stretched-out version of a self into the wider universe, the story takes on an even more uncanny shape. So far, we've been following a single line of awareness as it slips into rarer and rarer situations, surviving injuries, outliving expectations, drifting through worlds where your continued existence feels increasingly unlikely. But in a many worlds picture, improbability isn't a brick wall. It's just a thinner and thinner pathway through an endlessly branching forest. Every time you survive something that was overwhelmingly likely to end you, you don't just get lucky. You select, without meaning to, one of the most unusual branches available. You filter yourself into places where the odds have already been pushed hard in your favor, again and again and again. After a while, that pattern starts to look like a bubble. Inside this bubble, you are always the one who makes it through. The crash doesn't quite kill you. The tumor doesn't quite spread the way the doctors expect. The infection that statistically should have tipped you over the edge recedes at the last second. To the you who keeps waking up, the universe can begin to feel oddly biased, as if the deck is secretly stacked to keep your awareness going, no matter how many times the game should have ended. Outside the bubble, in the overwhelming majority of branches, nothing special is happening. Most versions of you live out lives of fairly ordinary length, and then die in fairly ordinary ways. In those worlds, your story fits neatly into the broader statistics of a mortal species in a large, indifferent universe. But you never experience those endings from the inside. From your vantage point within this thinning corridor of improbable survival, it's easy to misread what's happening. You look back on a lifetime of narrow escapes and begin to feel that there must be some hidden protection around you, some secret rule that keeps pulling you back from the edge. It may feel almost personal, as though the cosmos itself has chosen to keep you here. In reality, this is just what it's like to be an observer at the far edge of a distribution. You're only around to notice anything at all in the branches where the line hasn't been cut. The worlds where the dice went against you simply don't appear in your experience. They exist in the wider multiverse, but not in your story. That bias, the fact that you can only ever see the paths where you're still here, is sometimes called an anthropic shadow. The universe can look strangely generous from inside that shadow, even if, from a God's eye view, nothing miraculous is happening at all. If you imagine this continuing decade after decade, the feeling of living in a private probability bubble becomes stronger. Life doesn't just feel unlikely in the sense that every existence is a miracle. It feels specifically tailored to your continued presence, as if events keep bending just enough to keep your awareness intact. You were in a wreck where no one should have walked away, and yet you did. You received a prognosis that should have been final, and yet you're still here, against expectations. You watch doctors shake their heads, baffled. You hear phrases like, "remarkable case." We don't see this often. Statistically, this shouldn't be happening. If quantum immortality were literally true, those phrases would be the background music of your extended life. And as time goes on, the adjustments reality has to make to keep you in play may grow more and more extreme. Small coincidences add up. A specialist happens to be on call that night. A power outage misses your floor by one circuit. A random mutation inside a cluster of cells turns out to be protective rather than lethal. Each individual twist is minor. Together, they build a world that feels increasingly out of joint, full of near misses and narrow escapes that are hard to explain without reaching for words like destiny or fate. It's not just your personal story either. On the grandest scales, the universe itself is moving toward its own kind of quiet ending. Stars burn out, galaxies drift apart. Energy spreads thinner and thinner. Far in the future, if our current cosmology holds, there comes a time when there are no usable gradients left, no easy way to extract work, no bright suns, just a cold, thin haze of particles in almost perfect balance. Physicists sometimes call this the heat death of the universe. Not an explosion, but an exhaustion, a long, slow sigh. Now imagine threading an immortal observer through that cosmic timeline. If consciousness like yours could always find some way to persist, riding the rare branches where events conspire to keep a thinking system going, then the universe, in a sense, would have to accommodate that. It would have to maintain, somewhere in the multiverse, increasingly exotic pockets of low-entropy structure, improbable stars still burning, improbable planets still supporting chemistry, improbable brains still flickering with thought, while the surrounding cosmos slouches toward uniform darkness. You don't need equations to feel the weight of that picture. In an ordinary story, both people and universes get to stop when their fuel runs out. Processes end. Patterns dissolve back into simpler pieces. Quantum immortality suggests a different story, a lingering of awareness into regions of possibility that are ever more remote, ever more costly in terms of the order they require. Each additional century, each additional eon of continued experience would be paid for by deeper and deeper dips into the unlikely. Your existence becomes a kind of drain on the universe's remaining capacity to do anything interesting at all. You're still here, but only because reality has contorted itself into very specific, very strange configurations to make room for you. Seen in that light, the image that emerges is stark. You're no longer a hero blessed with endless tomorrows, striding confidently through an infinite multiverse. You're more like a stubborn ember hanging on in the ashes, a tiny island of awareness floating in a sea that is, on average, growing colder, simpler, and more empty with every passing moment. It is a powerful, if unsettling, story, a single line of consciousness threading its way through a branching cosmos, always finding the rare pockets where it can continue, even as the broader universe relaxes into stillness. The further you follow that line, the lonelier it becomes. The more the background dims, the more improbable your very presence has to be. No wonder many physicists and philosophers feel that something has gone wrong in this picture, that somewhere along the way, an abstract interpretation of quantum mechanics has been turned into a kind of cosmic horror tale about a mind that never gets to rest. In the final stretch of our journey, we'll gently pull back from that nightmare and look at the reasons why quantum immortality might be more of a thought experiment than a literal fate, and how, even if it were possible, it would still leave us with the same quiet mystery we started with. The simple, fleeting fact of being aware, right now, in this particular corner of the universe. By now, the picture we've been painting is pretty heavy. A universe of endless branches and a single line of awareness threading its way through the strangest, most unlikely ones. It's natural, hearing all of that, to feel a chill run through you, as if you've just glimpsed some terrible secret hiding behind the laws of physics. So before we drift off tonight, it's important to slow down and gently admit something simple. This might all be wrong. Not just a little bit off, but wrong in a deep structural way. More like an interesting shadow cast by our theories and fears than a literal map of what your future will look like. To see why, we can start with the foundation this whole story is built on. Many worlds. In that picture, every possible outcome of a quantum event actually happens somewhere in the multiverse. But as soon as you say that, a tricky question appears. If everything that can happen does happen in some branch, what does probability even mean? In everyday life, probabilities tell you how likely an event is to occur. 1 chance in 2, 1 in 1,000, 1 in many trillions. But if all of those outcomes exist in parallel, then likelihood stops being about which one happens and becomes something more abstract. About how thick or thin a slice of the total wave function you're in. How much weight different possibilities carry. Physicists don't even fully agree on how to define that weight in a many worlds context. So when people say very confidently that your consciousness will tend to follow the branches where you survive, they're talking about probabilities in a framework where probability itself is already controversial. There's no clean, universally accepted way to justify the step from many branches exist to you personally will almost always find yourself in this special subset. Then there's the question of what exactly is doing the choosing. In the darker versions of quantum immortality, consciousness gets treated almost like a wandering spark that can hop between branches, skipping over the ones where it would have gone out. It's a striking image, but notice how quickly it drifts away from the way neuroscience actually talks about minds. In every serious scientific theory we have, consciousness isn't a free-floating thing that slides around the multiverse. It's something that emerges from the highly specific physical activity of a brain, electrical pulses, chemical gradients, networks of neurons firing in complex patterns. When that activity stops in a given branch, when the tissue breaks down or the blood stops flowing, there is no awareness left inside that world to continue anything. For quantum immortality to work the way the thought experiment suggests, your awareness would have to somehow know about other branches in which the brain remains intact, and then relocate itself there. But we don't have any evidence that such cross-branch communication is possible or even meaningful within our current understanding of physics. Information, as far as we can tell, is very local. It doesn't leak sideways into alternate realities. That leads to another problem. You can't test any of this. Good scientific ideas don't just sound clever. They make predictions you can check. Quantum immortality, by contrast, is almost perfectly insulated from verification. If someone survives a ridiculous number of close calls, they might point to that as evidence. But someone who doesn't survive is no longer around to report their side of the story. No matter what happens, the theory can always say, "Of course, that's exactly what I'd expect. If you're here, it claims you're on the special path. If you're not, there's no one left to argue." That's not really science. It's more like a funhouse mirror for our hopes and anxieties about death. So, one way to soften the horror is simply to recognize quantum immortality for what it is: an imaginative extrapolation. A story you can tell at the far edge of certain interpretations of quantum mechanics. Not a fate stamped across your timeline. Not a destiny encoded in the wave function of the universe. And there's another layer to all of this too. One that's gentler. It may be that our brains just aren't built to fully grasp these kinds of questions. Concepts like infinity, endless branching universes, or the final state of all existence push far beyond the scales our ancestors ever needed to understand in order to stay alive. Some philosophers call this cognitive closure. The idea that there are truths which might be real, but permanently out of reach for creatures like us. If that's the case, then it's no surprise that when we try to picture the ultimate bookends of reality, birth, death, the total shape of time, we end up with stories that are part physics, part mythology, part nightmare. We're mapping a territory that may not fit inside our heads, and the maps come out warped. The comforting thing is, that's okay. You don't need a final theory of consciousness or a definitive answer about multiverses to make sense of your own small life. You don't have to know whether awareness flickers out forever at your last breath, or whether reality continues in ways we can barely imagine. Those are fascinating possibilities to explore while you're awake, but they don't have to sit on your chest when you're trying to sleep. Right now, what is undeniably real is much simpler. You're here, in whatever room you happen to be in tonight. Your chest is rising and falling. Your mind is still enough, at least for this moment, to follow a slow line of words about a universe that is vast and strange, and, somehow, capable of producing a person exactly like you. Someone who worries and wonders, and stays up a little too late listening to ideas that stretch the imagination. For all of our equations and theories, that basic fact is still astonishing. A thin film of life on a small planet around an ordinary star, and within that film, a nervous system that can look out at the cosmos and ask, "What am I? What happens when I'm gone?" The universe has become self-aware, in a modest, fragile way, and tonight that awareness is passing through your particular point of view. Whether that stream of experience continues beyond your final heartbeat, or whether it dissolves back into the larger pattern that gave rise to it, doesn't change the quiet beauty of the time you do have. Each ordinary moment, the feel of a pillow, the sound of distant traffic, the comfort of another breath arriving right on schedule, is already complete. It doesn't need an infinite sequel to matter. So as we come to the end of this journey, you might let yourself set the big questions down for a while. They'll still be there tomorrow, or next week, or whenever your mind is restless enough to pick them up again. For now, you're allowed to simply exist. To be a human being lying in the dark, listening to a voice and feeling the edges of your awareness soften. If these late-night explorations make the universe feel a little wider, or your own worries a little lighter, you're always welcome to come back. You can quietly follow along, or if you'd like to help this little corner of the internet grow, you can gently tap like or subscribe so you can find your way here again. But you don't have to do anything at all. For the next few moments, there is nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to solve, just the simple rhythm of your breathing, the weight of your body being held by whatever you're resting on, and the knowledge that, at least for tonight, it's enough to be here, exactly as you are. Wherever you happen to be in the world, I hope sleep comes easily for you. I hope your mind unwinds, your muscles loosen, and the noise of the day fades into the background. Rest well.